Hello and welcome to Film 253 Narrative for the Digital Age. Today we are going to talk about the use of Brechtian alienation techniques in the films of Jean-Luc Godard. In the previous lecture, I discussed the use of Brechtian techniques in Hollywood films, the idea of breaking the fourth wall. You saw certain examples from Woody Allen films who had a role in popularizing such techniques in Hollywood films, because in the classical Hollywood era, such break of the fourth wall was not really permittable. So from the 60s, and it was due to the influence of new wave cinematic movements in Europe in the 60s and 70s, that new American filmmakers from the 60s on started to use such Brechtian techniques, the Brechtian distanciation. And this is a common technique in contemporary Hollywood films and also TV series. We discussed films such as American Beauty, for example, or horror films made by Wes Craven. But today I want to talk about more didactic origin of such techniques in the films of Jean-Luc Godard. Because originally such techniques were used to deny the audience's pleasure or the idea of immersing yourself or to some degree identification with the characters on the screen. So there was a very political, radical approach involved in the 60s with the French New Wave and specifically with the films of Jean-Luc Godard. Because what you see in contemporary Hollywood films, like horror movies or comedies, is the use of these techniques to actually add the audience's pleasure and involvement and engagement with the movie work. For example, with the works of Wes Craven's, such as Wes Craven's Scream or Wes Craven's New Nightmare, what he's doing, he's just using self-reflexivity. He breaks one layer of illusion only to wrap another layer of illusion around it. So for such mainstream Hollywood movies, the use of self-reflexivity is more immersive and not as didactic like the films of Jean-Luc Godard. Godard in his early films uses more common Brechtian techniques. For example, just when the actor breaks the fourth wall and addresses the camera directly. And in that sense, we have a dialogue between the screen and the spectators. He also was a pioneer for the idea of discontinuity editing by introducing jump cuts in his first film, Breathless. It is in his later films that he started to use ideas of the German playwright Bertolt Brecht to its end and transfer it through certain cinematic techniques. The use of sound, acting, voiceover narration, lighting, and editing are all used to alienate the viewers, to break the cinematic illusions and make them aware of the modes of production. Often expressing his political views, he thought of such alienating techniques as very political and potentially liberating cinema. Involved with the events of May 68, he became interested in left-wing Maoist politics. There are also references in his films to Algerian revolutionary movements, Vietnam War, or even sometimes gender politics in terms of how the mainstream media portrayed women. What he was particularly interested in was the audience's engagement with the process of filmmaking, reducing the medium's capacity in what film theorists such as Andre Bazin would say the reproduction of nature realistically. Before becoming a filmmaker, Jean-Luc Godard used to write for a magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma, knowing for intellectual film criticism at the time, and Cahiers du Cinéma was an important magazine in promoting the French New Wave in the 60s. The next clip that you're going to see is coming from Godard's first film, breathless. And you can see the idea of discontinuity editing in this scene.
Piéton foncé, c'est tout ce que je vous demande. Oh, le pour eux, nom de Dieu, ça traîne. Bah toute l'aile avant-gauche de la Thunderbird arrachée. Moi, rien. Regarde la maison où je suis né. En face, ils ont construit une maison horrible. Ça me détruit le moral des maisons pareilles. Toute la beauté du carrefour est fichue maintenant.
Oui?
Oui, moi, j'ai le sens de la beauté. Beauté. Mais non, passez par le Châtelet. J'arrive en retard, c'est de ta faute.
Absolument pas.
Allez, mon vieux, dépassez la 403. Touchez pas votre changement de vitesse. Ce que ça veut dire, freiner derrière une 4 chevaux. Tenez, regardez, vous faites dépasser par un manurin. Mettez votre clignotant, tourne à gauche. Topez là, je reviens. Oui, monsieur. Il y a 5 minutes.
Ton ami qui te doit de l'argent?
Antonio Berruti, oui. Ta faute. Maintenant, c'est qui tout double.
Pourquoi?
Je t'expliquerai. Allez, mon gros père, reste pas derrière la 2 chevaux. Où tu vas maintenant?
Au New York Herald.
Tournez pas la tête, regardez devant vous. Quoi ça sert d'écrire des articles?
Ça m'a sert d'avoir de l'argent et d'être libre des hommes. Je trouve que les Parisiennes ont des robes trop courtes. Ça fait poule.
Allez, je t'en prie. On a envie de courir derrière et de leur faire comme ça.
Ne te gêne surtout pas.
Stoppez là!
His later films are even more didactic in terms of using Brechtian alienation techniques. He started to use something that is known as quotations. Often there are intertitles inserted in the middle of action, usually with abstract messages to just provoke the audiences. So instead of jump cuts, he uses these intertitles. He also uses intertextual references to pop images of the time that people are familiar with, and sometimes even paintings, quotations from philosophical ideas, and so on are just inserted in the middle of action. The next clip that I want to show is from his film Weekend. In this film, even the use of sound is very alienating at certain points. For example, there is a dialogue between a male character and female characters, and the soundtrack doesn't match with the ups and downs of the dialogue and sometimes become silent for no reason. The camera also keeps denying what people are expected to see on this screen, in a way, challenging the audience's expectations in unique ways. Some of these techniques are used in the next clip from Weekend. You can see in the first part of the clip there is a scene of a woman in a bathtub. The camera denies the pleasure of perhaps what the male audience would expect to see, but at the same time, there is an image in the background that is actually reminding the male viewer what is that they wanted to look at. And right at this moment, you can see important political conversations and the use of quotations, those intertitles with abstract messages that are just inserted quickly, and how the camera digress from what is being shown. So there are images from places outside irrelevant to where the conversation is taking place. Following that, there is a scene of murdering an old woman, but the camera denies our voyeuristic curiosity to see this violent act. Instead, it is showing us the skinned rabbit, another violent image, but something that we are not pleased to see, although it's something that we eat all the time. And at the peak of the action, instead of a specific sound, effect or anything. We hear a conversation, ordinary conversation, nothing really emotional, that is placed above the action. And then you see human blood on top of the skinned rabbit.
Les grandes civilisations précolombiennes, Incas, Mayas, Aztèques, en étaient au terme de leur histoire autonome, au point où finissait l'histoire héroïque des Grecs et où commençait leur histoire de société de classe.
Notre faute si on n'était pas là quand ton père est mort.
Non, moi d'abord.
Je crois qu'elle a dû tout faire.
Qu'est-ce qu'elle t'a dit exactement?
Que vous avez pu partager 50-50.
Chier que ça pour rien.
Qu'est-ce que c'est ce bouquin?
Elle m'a prêté.
À l'origine, l'hippopotame vivait sur la terre, mais il alla trouver le maître des animaux et le pria de l'autoriser à vivre dans l'eau.
Ça se passera pas comme ça.
Le maître refusa. Pourquoi demanda l'hippopotame dépité. Parce que tu es un être monstrueux, reprit le maître.
Je te jure que ça se passera pas comme ça.
Des animaux et que tu mangerais tous les poissons. Non, protesta l'hippopotame, je jure sur l'honneur que je ne mangerai pas un seul poisson. Qui croira jamais une créature aussi affreuse, dit le maître avec impatience.
Ça se passera pas comme ça, Roland.
L'hippopotame réfléchit. Maître, dit-il enfin, je vais vous faire une proposition. Si vous me laissez vivre dans l'eau, chaque fois que j'aurai besoin de chier, j'étalerai ma merde avec ma queue, et vous verrez vous-même qu'elle ne contiendra pas la règle de poisson. Le maître des animaux jugea la proposition honnête, et l'hippopotame fut autorisé.
Ça se passera pas comme ça, Roland.
Corinne, Roland, dépêchez-vous.
Est une créature toute différente, du moins. La nuit nous cache-t-elle ce remarquable assemblage de laideur, les yeux globuleux,
Écoute-moi, Roland.
sa bouche énorme, son corps difforme, ses pattes exagérément courtes et sa queue ridicule.
Écoute-moi.
Peut-être que vu par des yeux d'hippopotame, il représente le canon de la
Mais
beauté.
écoute-moi,
Mais je ne
enfin.
suis pas un hippopotame, je le considère non seulement comme l'être le plus disgracieux qui
Écoute-moi,
soit,
Roland.
mais encore comme un insondable abîme de stupidité.
Écoute-moi.
Je ne me serais pas étendu aussi longtemps sur la version que m'inspire
Écoute-moi,
cette
Roland.
horrible bête si je n'étais convaincu que son acceptation servile de la vie collective constitue le côté le plus abject de sa nature.
Écoute-moi, Roland, il n'y a qu'à trouver quelque chose.
Yaka, 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 yaka.
Tu vas chez Monsieur Flaubert, chercher le lapin.
60-40, belle maman.
Pas question,
70-30,
pas question.
80-20.
Non, pas question.
Enfin, belle maman, soyez raisonnable, 90-10.
Oh, mais non, dis après que 4 millions, c'est pas possible, enfin.
Bon, on y va. Quoi on fait?
Le système du docteur Petiot,
Non, la fumée là pour les voisins.
le système du docteur Goudron et du professeur Plume, là. Je sais, on l'a fout dans le coffre de l'ADS.
On trouvera un accident sur l'autoroute en rentrant.
On fera comme si l'ADS en faisait partie.
Et on fout le feu avec de l'essence à toutes les bagnoles.
Génial.
C'est le crime parfait.
À nous la belle vie.
Et les 50 millions.
Je t'aime.
Moi aussi.
J'ai mis de l'essence partout.
The films of Jean-Luc Godard are often narratively fragmented. In his adaptations of Shakespeare's King Lear, he is not making King Lear non-linear, but also the process of making King Lear self-reflexively is non-linear. In short, the fragmented narrative and the use of discontinuity editing in his films deliberately subverts the conventions of mainstream cinema and urges the viewers towards the re-evaluation of the social attitudes that the mainstream cinema reflects. Radical content, he believes, cannot put into traditional forms. A film theorist by the name of Peter Wallen suggests that the cinema of Jean-Luc Godard creates a form of counter-cinema that destroys the visual pleasures and the audience's realistic engagement with that of the film world. In that clip from Weekend, you saw how the camera totally broke away with the characters and got its own consciousness. So, in a way, camera's movement is not motivated by that of the character's actions or ideas, by things like a strange tracking shot, absence of depth, and that sort of discontinuity editing. Godard tries to distance the spectator from the characters. So Peter Wallen's chart in terms of the conventions of classical cinema versus counter cinema is reproduced here. By narrative intransitivity, Peter Wallen means when the scenes are organized not based on causality. There are always digression, repetition, and interruption. The reason for that is that Godard wants to reduce the emotional appeal of the narrative and give the audience a chance to re-evaluate and focus her attention on something else. So, estrangement versus identification. Estrangement happens when we have direct address by the characters, and sometimes we have editorial commentaries. We hear Jean-Luc Godard's voiceover at certain points. Like, look at this next scene from Two or Three Things I Know About Her. So there's a moment that one of the characters is drinking coffee. We hear Jean-Luc Godard's commentary about different things in the universe.
Peut-être qu'un objet est ce qui permet de relier, de passer d'un sujet à l'autre, donc de vivre en société, d'être ensemble. Mais alors, puisque la relation sociale est toujours ambiguë, puisque ma pensée divise autant qu'elle unit, puisque ma parole rapproche par ce qu'elle exprime et isole par ce qu'elle tait, puisqu'un immense fossé sépare la certitude subjective que j'ai de moi-même et la vérité objective que je suis pour les autres, puisque je n'arrête pas de me trouver coupable alors que je me sens innocent, puisque chaque événement transforme ma vie quotidienne, puisque j'échoue sans cesse à communiquer, je veux dire à comprendre, à aimer, à me faire aimer, et que chaque échec me fait éprouver ma solitude, puisque... Puisque je ne peux pas m'arracher à l'objectivité qui m'écrase, ni à la subjectivité qui m'exile, puisqu'il ne m'est pas permis ni de m'élever jusqu'à l'être, ni de tomber dans le néant. Il faut que j'écoute, il faut que je regarde autour de moi plus que jamais, le monde, mon semblable, mon frère.
What you just saw was from the movie Two or Three Things I Know About Her. The next issue is transparency versus foregrounding. By foregrounding, he means making the mechanics of the film visible. At the end of Alphaville, Godard turned the image into negative, for examples. Or in the movie that I showed a clip Weekend, you see examples of scratching or damaging the film strip. This is not just an avant-garde choice. He's not interested in designificantizing the film, But as Wallen would suggest, it's about negation. It's again for the audience to refocus their attention. The next concept is single diegesis versus multiple diegesis. In Hollywood films, usually the entire films belong to the same film word or the genre of the movie, for example. We always know how the film word of Hitchcock looks like, or that of Woody Allen. Godard movies sometimes have the idea of film within a film, or sometimes just film side another one. And these film words are not just different in the style and also in terms of content, but actually contradictory. The next one is closure versus aperture. Again, the narrative structure of Godard's films are not self-contained or harmonious. It's not what we saw in our three-act structure session. Instead, they are open-ended, they're full of intertextual references to different things, intellectual ideas, philosophies, paintings, also images from pop cultures. Sometimes American comics are just inserted. And you really need a degree of familiarity with those images to understand the films. And it's okay, you're going to see this movie Pierrot Le Fou. Maybe you wouldn't know about these intertextual references to Michel Foucault, some Renaissance paintings, the poems of Federico Garcia Lorca. But you can possibly relate yourself better with more like North American references, such as those of pop cultures or Fitzgerald. What I want to say that it's two word, like the word of the film and that ideological explanations by referring to those intertextual codes. Try to see as a contemporary spectator to what degree you can relate yourself with the film's ideological issues if you do not have a background with regards to those intertextual references. The next issue is pleasure versus unpleasure. Godard believes that classical films are a form of bourgeois entertainment. A great many devices he uses in his films are to break that sort of direct relationship between the audience and the image. And the last idea is fiction versus reality. Godard is not interested in fiction cinema, but also not interested in the idea of cinema as mechanical reproduction of nature. His films are actually very flat, use of superficial images, colors, blood. So while watching Pierrot Le Fou this week, try to identify devices, Brechtian devices that are used by Godard for alienating the viewers and making our immersive identification with the characters preventable.